Hi, Richard.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How about yourself?
I cannot complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Richard Hanania, a political scientist, and some other things. You're president of something. What are you president of?
Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideologies, CSPI for short.
Are you still at Defense Priorities?
Yeah, I still have an affiliation.
So you're a research fellow there, I think. But most important for our purposes, you are the author of a new book. Congratulations, called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. And that's what we're going to talk about. Now, the subtitle of the book, the title of the book, as the title of the book suggests, it's in some ways an academic book for an academic audience, but it has real world stakes, which are kind of spelled out by the subtitle. How generals, weapons manufacturers, and foreign governments shape American foreign policy. You could say, I think without egregiously distorting it, that it's about why American foreign policy is not coherent.
Right.
I might go so far as to say why it's so screwed up. But in any event, it's also about why, and this is kind of a bridge between the real world applications and the academic argument. It's about why it would be naive to expect American foreign policy to be coherent in the first place, right?
Right. I think that's true. Right.
And why don't we? Well, why don't you take it from there, and then I will, step in and maybe steer it either toward the academic or toward the layperson as I deem necessary. But what is your opening pitch about the book?
Yeah. So the way you describe it, you hit on something interesting. So my background is studying academic international relations. So I come at this having read international relations theory and empirical quantitative work and all that stuff, and sort of just being uncomfortable with it for a while, but using it sort of as the framework to try to understand foreign policy and what's going on. At the same time, I'm somebody and I've written about this, who thinks that academia in general is a little bit too divorced from the real world. I think it often gets in love with its theories and doesn't pay enough attention to what's actually happening in the world, and is not too interested in checking how well those theories work against everything else. So I take both those perspectives in writing this book, and it's something I wrote, while I was still thinking about an academic career, but sort of, one foot out the door. And so the book starts with some theory. So it's got something for everything. If you like international relations theory, if you're interested in social science and how academics think about these things, and why, in my opinion, they're wrong, their frameworks don't work, there's something in there for you. If you're just interested in American foreign policy and you want to know, what were we doing during the war on terror? What are the causes and the effects and sort of the mechanics of the American sanctions regime? You could skip the theory chapter and you can just read those chapters too. And so that's the perspective of the book. And as far as the question whether it would be naive to think that that there can be coherence in American foreign policy, I think that's right. Something I punt on a little bit in the book is I don't apply it. I don't say this is a universal theory of foreign policy. You could imagine states where there's more centralized control, or you could imagine the U.S. becoming something like that, like during wartime, like World War II. I think you could say we had a grand strategy for winning the war. It's about America in normal times, probably to a lesser extent democracy.
Right.
The more similar a system is to ours in its historical situation and its sort of governance makeup, the more the theory in the book applies. But yes, I think you're right. I think it's naive to think in terms of grand strategy for American when thinking about American foreign policy. And I argue that this is my way is consistent with the way we think about politics and governance more generally.
Right. And I definitely want to get to that question of how broadly applicable this kind of skepticism of how coherent foreign policy would likely be. How to what extent does it apply to adversaries? Because our main adversaries are not as democratic as our country, maybe are not as pluralistic as our country, and you might expect more rationality. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I think in a weird way, a common mistake we make with these particular adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran is to attribute too little rationality to the foreign policy in a sense. I don't want to get into that now, but I think you know what I mean, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
and to a little bit more of a kind of a tease is what we'll get into is I think your theory helps explain why we sometimes don't attribute even as much rationality to those countries as we should, because some of the forces you see as corrupting, that's my word, our foreign policy, um, encourage us to look at other countries as as more irrational than they are in a weird way, right?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of my book is, there's a part about concentrated interest. That's sort of the heart of the book. But there's also a little bit more of a subtle theory in that I don't say ideas don't matter. I think that ideas and interests are sort of intertwined. So there's, when people say is American foreign policy driven by certain ideas? Yes, in a certain sense, but there's all kinds of people out there with all kinds of ideas. The people who run foreign policy in Washington are not representative, for example, of the field of international relations, not necessarily representative of the public at large. So which people with which ideas sort of get into positions of power and influence? And I argue that they're the people who have ideas that are conducive to the interests and the sort of the ego and the material interests or non-tangible interests of powerful concentrated interests with a stake in foreign policy outcomes. And so you select for a kind of person, I think, who's geared towards a more militaristic solutions. And I think that if you think in terms of other, international relations theorists are good at coming up with why, ways that we can make peace and ways we cannot fight, because, they draw a chart and they say that it's game theory. And if we just get to cooperate, there's often a way to do that. And I think our foreign policy establishment selects for people who don't think in those terms. They think in sort of terms of good versus evil, or sometimes you say we don't attribute to them rationality, or we attribute to them rationality, but like unlimited ambitions. So if Putin does something in Ukraine now, he'll go to Poland and he'll go to Germany next. He can't just care about Ukraine. And you'll see the same things with China. It's almost a plan for world domination or something along those lines, remaking the world order. It can't be just a few border disputes. So you're right. There's this aspect of not seeing them as rational. And then there's an aspect of when you see them as rational, see them as having unlimited ambitions, and in which case you just have to fight them. Maybe there's not much you can do there.
Yeah. So yeah, and I guess when I say irrational, I mean partly, yeah, motivated by something other than consideration for the actual well-being of their country, right? I mean, or the well-being of their people. But anyway, we'll get into all of that. Let's start at the beginning. So you're saying that in a way, the whole field of international relations, which of course includes a number of different perspectives. You've got realists and you've got different kinds of realists and you've got liberal internationalists and so on. But you're saying the whole field pretty much assumes that you should treat a given country as kind of a single rational actor that has clear goals and pursues them rationally, right?
Well, okay, so I think if you went to the typical international relations scholar and you say the entire field, thinks in these terms, I think they would object very strongly, and they would say, this is one sort of branch and one part of IR, and even with what's called liberalism in international relations, it's more optimistic about cooperation, but also starts with the irrational actor model. But they're right that like a lot of academia, it's fragmented, and there's a million different people who believe in a million different things and a million different theories. My argument is that, well, first of all, I think if you had to pick one one sort of dominant worldview, it's probably realism/liberalism. When you put those two, those are both rational choice-based models. When you put those together, you would maybe not get a majority, but you'll at least get plurality. So if we have to talk about international relations as one thing, I mean, it would have to be that rather than.
And do you want to spell out just quickly for people and you'll have to oversimplify a little, but
Sure.
realism and liberalism, or liberal internationalism or whatever, what you mean by those?
Okay, so yeah, realism, I mean, more with the most commonly associated with people like John Mersheimer, Stephen Walt, the late Kenneth Waltz. And the idea is basically, yeah, we treat states as unitary actors, and you can basically build models based on that idea. So if you have or your audience has studied economics at all, it's basically just think about economics where microeconomics, you start with the individual and then you build theories about what happens in the world based on, thinking about the individual being rational, right? It's this, but basically applied to states. Now, realism, that's like sort of the positive definition, sort of how it explains the world. There's also a normative aspect to it, in that the people who have been famous realists have tended to be skeptical of a human rights-based foreign policy. They've tended to be skeptical of universalism. They're not pacifists or isolationists, but they don't, they've tended to be, sort of skeptical of Vietnam, Iraq, these little wars they think don't matter and are driven by ideology and pathologies in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have liberalism, which is basically, it starts with the same assumption, rational actor model. But I would say that the difference is that it's a little more optimistic about cooperation. So people like John Eikenberry, he says, the U.S. set up the post-World War II order, and basically everyone figured out how to live, in a sort of way that was beneficial for most people because of, American hegemony. And you don't have to assume anyone was doing it for the greater good or for some kind of ideological reasons. State interest is enough. And I would say, so these are maybe the plurality sort of way of looking at international relations. I'd say a couple of things too, and that when you read just a typical op-ed in, say, the Wall Street Journal or in the media, it's more this kind of worldview is more dominant there than it would be even in academia. So as far as the public understanding of international relations, like I had a review of the Thucydides Trap by Graham Allison, and this was a book not like something academics take very seriously, but taken very seriously in sort of the punditocracy. And this is just a pure sort of realist understanding.
And it's the idea that, and it's applied to the U.S. and China, but that when there is a great power that's in decline and there's an ascendant power, which would be China in this case, there's almost inevitable conflict or very likely conflict, because the great power is going to have trouble adjusting to its new status and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And there's all kinds of problems with this, and I go into them, but yeah, that's basically the idea, is that this is the sort of a realist type of theory. And so like when people's idea of academic international relations, I think, relies heavily on this idea. And another point that I make is, I think that if you get away from realism, you have a hard time justifying international relations as its own field. So I think this is maybe something people not in academia don't necessarily care about. But there's political science, and there's American politics, and there's international relations, and the sort of the justification for having your own subfield is you have some kind of methodology or some kind of insight that does not apply to others. And so you could argue that if you sort of do away with the unitary actor model, you're in a place where you're using the same tools as the rest of political science, which other political scientists might not care about, or the rest of the world might not care about. But I think that sort of self-justification for the field has been a motivator behind these ideas becoming so influential.
Okay. I mean, just a little further on realism and liberalism. I mean, could one say that, and I think this would be inconsistent with what you just said, maybe, but couldn't one say that liberals think more than realists, that actually there are a lot of non-zero sum situations in the world such that cooperation is in a nation's self-interest, A, and B, nations being rational recognize those, or we can at least hope that, and act on them, and so you get cooperation. So they're both assuming unitary rational actors that act on self-interest, and just assuming different things about the extent of non-zero sum dynamics in the world.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why liberalism is seen as sort of an extension, or it's not a complete refutation of realism. There's something called constructivism, which is more about the ideas and sort of idealism and the social construction of the whole thing, and related to like postmodern philosophy and all that. But yeah, that's the difference between realism and liberalism. And I guess my view is I think I do agree with. I mean, I do agree with liberals in the academic sense, that there's a lot more opportunities for cooperation than, say, American foreign policy tends to assume. It's still, though, I think I would still take issue with it as sort of a unitary actor model, as a as an explanation for how American foreign policy actually works. I
Hmm.
think it's still as as chaotic as as I describe in
Right.
the book. But yeah, I mean these are sort of two different issues. How much beneficial cooperation you think is possible, and then sort of how coherent you think American foreign policy. There's two axes here that we could
Yeah.
separate.
Okay. So your one thing you're saying is, why don't we look at foreign policy more like the way we look at domestic policy? When we look at domestic policy, we don't really expect it to make a lot of sense, to be coherent, because we recognize that it's we've seen the sausage factory at work here, and we recognize that the domestic policy making process is the result of conflict among a number of interests. And sometimes one prevails, sometimes the other prevails. There's no like grand architect whose wishes are always realized in domestic policy. You just have this big battle and you win some and you lose some. And so there isn't necessarily overarching philosophical consistency. And you're saying, why would you expect foreign policy to be? There will be differences in the nature of the domestic influences brought to bear on foreign policy as opposed to domestic. But you're saying, broadly speaking, it's just going to be, in both cases, a free for all, and you shouldn't expect coherence to emerge, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of just inertia and sort of, historical contingency. So, two big, huge parts of the federal budget are Social Security and Medicare. I don't think anyone says we have a grand strategy in this country for dealing with retirement, right? We had FDR, and, he wanted to do some things, he did them, and sort of it's been running on autopilot mostly since. And then you look at something like, I bring up immigration because it's such an interesting case, because it's such an interesting example of unintended consequences. Basically, people thought they were in the 1960s. Basically, they tried to direct the immigration system towards family reunification, which they thought would keep the white majority, which actually had the opposite effect because there was chain migration. People would come from non-white countries, and they were the ones who had relatives overseas. And so we get this. I mean, if you look at just a typical history of immigration or a typical history of healthcare, that's sort of a default way of understanding things. Now, you look at American foreign policy, there's more continuance here, or just as much continuance as in these other fields. One of my favorite things in the little factoids in the book is if you look at 2019, where the most American troops are stationed, besides Afghanistan, you have Germany, Italy, Japan, and South Korea. Now, those are the same countries with the most American troops in 1950, right? The U.S. is still basically occupying the Axis powers and fighting the Korean War. What a kind of coincidence is that our grand strategy requires us to still be in these countries, 70 years later. 30 years we could still be in those countries, and people would say this is American grand strategy. But it seems like the continuation is the most important thing. It's like if we didn't have troops in Afghanistan, nobody would say we'd send them at this point. And no, now that they're not there, nobody is seriously arguing or able to argue that they can go back, right? It's just that we understand that there's sort of this path dependency here, and I'm trying to basically integrate international relations to I think what are more sophisticated understandings of politics when we think
Right.
about most other issues.
And this is where the term public choice theory comes in. Again, the title of the book is Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. Uh, I don't know very much about public choice theory, but I gather the idea is it is applied to the domestic policymaking process. The assumption is that you do have these groups that represent a bunch of people sometimes, like the American Association of Retired Persons, or whatever they say the letters stand for now that they've kind of rebranded. Um, and they rationally, more or less rationally, pursue the perceived interests of their constituency. So you have all of these rational actors making the policy, but the result is not rational and coherent. And here's a sentence from your book. The irony of this approach to foreign affairs is that if we treat individuals as rational actors, then we have a reason to believe that states will not be. And you're saying we understand that to be the case in domestic policy, that you have these rational groups representing people who belong to the groups for rational interest reasons, but the result is not rational, coherent policy. You're saying the same irony, in a way, prevails in foreign policy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think you described it well. So public choice theory is basically economists trying to understand political outcomes. So they take the tools of economics, which is the rational individual, at its heart, and then apply it to legislators acting the way they do, and lobbyists and corporations and voters and everyone else, right? And one of the insights of public choice theory, maybe a fundamental insight or close to it, if you're going to say just sort of one of the headlines of this, of what public choice has contributed to our understanding, is that small concentrated groups with an outsized interest in an issue are more likely to overcome a collective action problem. So if you're Boeing or you're Raytheon, and billions and billions of dollars depend on the outcome of the negotiations of the Pentagon budget, and you're put them against the taxpayer, who might have an interest in paying lower taxes, but it's basically the entire country, right? So no individual taxpayer has really much of an interest to care about the Pentagon budget all that much. Boeing and Raytheon, will get their way because they're a small, they're concentrated interests. So the groups that I highlight are concentrated interests who care most about foreign policy, and they have rational reasons to care about foreign policy. And rational choice theory is not always just about material interest. The analysis can work if there's a small group with a moral concern, or moral stake in an issue, right? Or people who have sort of a prestige-based interest. Like I think a lot of the national security establishment, there is financial interest there, but I think there's a prestige-based thing there, and I think we have to think about that too. And so this is the jumping off point for the analysis. It's funny because people sort of see a rational choice in international affairs and rational choice in economics as sort of complementary. And there was actually a paper that looked at the economic views of international relations scholars who accept realism, and there was a correlation between that and accepting sort of more free market oriented policies. And it's actually and if you look at our landscape of American foreign policy, I think that conservatives tend to like markets, and they tend to like this sort of hard-headed realism that sort of resembles how you think about markets. And my argument is there's a superficial resemblance there, but if you really think about it, and I think libertarians get this right, because libertarians will take that the rational choice model of economics and apply it more consistently than conservatives do. They won't have this cognitive dissonance when it comes to foreign policy for reasons of nationalism or patriotism or whatever. I argue that the rational choice model, exactly as that quote says, as applied to individuals, is very inconsistent to applying it to states.
And you just kind of highlighted one difference between foreign policy and domestic policy, and it's reflected in your subtitle, which is, again, how generals, weapons manufacturers, and foreign governments shape American foreign policy. I mean, you might note a contrast. Those do represent what you see as kind of the big three constituencies in a way, the big three shapers, where generals are a stand-in for the whole kind of national security establishment, I guess. And then,
I think, the title was long enough as this.
Yeah. But the first thing that strikes you about that is, well, those three groups aren't collectively very representative of the American people. When you look at domestic policy, you've got these big groups that represent a lot of people: National Rifle Association, AARP. And of course, it has been said about foreign policy that, this difference has been noted in the sense that what is said is that because so few Americans really care much about foreign policy, unless you got like a Vietnam situation and suddenly your sons are coming home in body bags, because of this, pretty widespread apathy about foreign policy, the field is left to a few intensely motivated actors, and they have disproportionate influence. And in your view, these are the three that we just mentioned. But that is an important difference between foreign policy and domestic policy, right?
Yeah, I mean, voters, they care about all kinds of things, right? And you can make foreign policy salient, or you can, leaders can make it less salient, but people have no direct experience. I mean, to them, they're just places on maps, and the knowledge. I mean, you can it's impolite to say, but there's polls on what how many people can find Iran on a map, or how many people can find Iraq on a map, and they're dismally low. I mean, the knowledge here is just very, very low. I mean, knowledge on policy in general is low, but Social Security, I mean, people at least know a check is coming, and taxes, people know how much they're paying in taxes, and so there's some direct experience with what's happening, and some direct sort of day-to-day interest. But yeah, with foreign policy, most Americans don't travel abroad. They don't have familiarity with foreign language. I mean, these are just abstract things. What is China, or what is Germany, or what is Russia to the average American? It's something they hear about in the news, and it's so funny. I see polls sometimes. They'll say, "Oh, public opinion of China has dropped." Like, okay, like the average American has not ever met a Chinese person at any point. They haven't done any research on China. It's just basically a measure of the media coverage of China or Russia or any other country. And so that there's these things exist as abstractions, and and there's other things that make foreign policy difficult, because just the whole entire practice of sort of classified information, right? Like, so like in Social Security policy or tax policy, they don't say we have all this information that we rely on that we can't tell you, the public, about, right? And so maybe to a certain extent that's necessary, but I think anyone who's looked at it reasonably knows they overdo the classification thing. And then the way it works in practice is often the classified information they want you to see will get leaked and be on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. So there's this, there's all these natural advantages, I think, that elites and concentrated interest have in foreign policy that they don't have elsewhere. The inherent secrecy of it, the classified information, the lack of personal experience, and this makes it just so divorced from sort of normal politics that these groups can sort of run wild. I mean, the U.S. adds Macedonia to NATO. I mean, what percentage of the population even knows that happened? It's got to be just a few percent, but potentially has large consequences down the line. Now, if Russia invades Ukraine, or there's some actual conflict, then Americans will start tuning in, and they won't know what's been going on the last 30 years in Eastern Europe, because they never.
And when they start tuning in, part of your argument is that what they see, how their views will be shaped by what they see on the media, is itself shaped by these actors, right? These three interests that you're identifying will be non-trivially responsible for the shaping of people's ideas on this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book that I was one of the sort of one of those facts that really had a big influence on the way I saw the world was the Project for a New American Century. I think a lot of your listeners will know what that is. For those who don't, they were these neocons who were very influential in conservative politics and sort of were in position to push the U.S. into Iraq after 9/11. It was basically founded by a former executive at Lockheed Martin. I mean, it's amazing, right?
Is that right?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, the public face was like Bill Kristol, Bob Kagan, but who was the founding?
His name was Bruce Jackson. He was like the vice president or something very high up in. He came straight from Lockheed Martin.
Well, by the way, to get back to Ukraine, and if you go back in the 90s, I came across a New York Times piece about when they were deciding whether to expand NATO, some group like the Committee to blah, 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 whatever the hell, but it was founded by an arms guy.
It was the same guy.
It was the same guy. Oh my God.
Yes.
Who is it? This guy should be famous. This guy should be famous. What's his name again?
Bruce Jackson. I looked it up. That's right. This story is told in Will.
So this guy is like single-handedly ruined the world.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he should get a medal. That's impressive.
Bill Kristol's out there on MSNBC, and
Bill Kristol is a mere puppet. Who knew? This guy, Bruce Jackson. Remember the name, folks. No, but don't do anything bad to him. Is he still around? I guess he is.
Let me see. I just pulled up his Wikipedia page. Looks like he's still around. Looks like he's elderly. He's at this point. It's in. If you go Will Hartung's book, Prophets of War. PROPHETS. It's about Lockheed.
Let me quickly say something in Bruce Jackson's defense. I don't know him, but human beings have a remarkable capacity to convince themselves that whatever they are advocating is the good thing to advocate. I'm sure he thinks of himself as meaning well. I happen to disagree with him on two big policy issues, apparently.
Yeah,
But
and so actually, yeah. So I'm looking at this right now. He was still vice president for strategy and planning Lockheed while PNAC. So he hadn't left. He hadn't left Lockheed Martin to found PNAC. It looks like this overlapped with when the Project for a New American Century was actually founded. So yeah, I mean, you scratch the surface of these things, and it's John Bolton. Another thing I point out is when I read John Bolton's biography, his memoir, his recent memoir that came out. He's basically talking about how between his stints in government, he's on so many corporate boards that he can't juggle them all. They just love John Bolton for his business insights, right? I mean, so you see what's going, and I don't doubt that John Bolton, he seemed he seems to believe what he.
He's sincere.
He seems sincere, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think he's more pro-war than you would expect him to be for his interests.
And just to drill down on kind of, in a sense, absolving these people for blame for all the destruction they wreak. My view of think tanks, which we should get into, it isn't that the people at the think tanks, the experts, think, oh, my salary is ultimately being paid by Boeing, so I'll say X, Y, and Z. The think tanks go out and find these people who genuinely believe that we should have a militaristic foreign policy. And so, I'm not really casting aspersions on them at that level.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think tanks, their money have to, they come from somewhere, and they're often foreign governments. They're often weapons manufacturers. They sometimes they voluntarily reveal this information, and people can look it up. It's not like it all comes from there, but a substantial portion. And there has been reports in the New York Times that often it will come with it's a little more explicit than that. There are actually strings attached, and the scholar is one step removed from the administration, but the administration sort of nudges you in certain directions and not others. And this is true for everyone. I mean, I've had people, with non-interventionists, people often say, sometimes correctly, you're funded by the Koch Foundation or Quincy Institute, Soros. And what I say about Koch and Soros is they're the only two guys funding foreign policy stuff that don't have a direct financial interest in the outcome of what they're funding, right?
Yeah.
And so
they are both, we should say, people may not know this about the Kochs because they just think of them as broadly right wing, but on foreign policy, Koch is non-interventionist, non-militarist.
Exactly. Yeah. So So I mean, it was on my CV online. People find that I got money as and they're funding people who are of a more anti-interventionist bent. I mean, that's anyone who's writing anything about anything has to is funded by somebody, and so that doesn't mean they're right or wrong, but most of the money and most of the big money is based by concentrated interest. People with they could be people with an ideological stake. So like Koch, like Soros, the people, Sheldon Adelson, he has some financial interest, but a lot of it is actually, ideological interest or genuine concern about Israel. And just have to ask who are behind a lot of the think tanks and all of the movements. Can
I just interject one thing? Sure. I mean, you could attribute financial motive even to the Kochs. There is the view that if you're a capitalist and you want to make money, you want the world to be a stable place without a lot of wars. You want a lot of commercial engagement that's not impeded by sanctions and so on. In fact, I wish more capitalists would view the situation that way. But it's not like, so I'm not saying any particular funder, we should assume any particular funder has, quote, pure motives, but they are rare in being significant funders. Koch and Soros on right and left respectively are rare in being non-militaristic funders of foreign policy.
I think that argument, it's a little bit hard to work because you think about sort of the cost benefit and the steps in the sort of the chain. You need to fund American foreign policy. You need it to become less militaristic. You need more world peace. There's a lot of steps in that chain, and so it's harder to imagine than just Lockheed Martin just funding Bill Kristol. You could see directly.
Right. There's more bang per buck for the lobbying, you might say, for Lockheed Martin. That's true.
Exactly. And I mean, the way the political coalitions are, it's sort of it tends not to work on the capitalists, tend to be more on the right, and they're with the weapons manufacturers. And some people say the Republican Party is actually corporatist, and then the support for military budgets would make sense. But yeah, you shouldn't dismiss or believe anybody based on their interest or sincerity. But if you're just sort of looking for a descriptive understanding of how foreign policy works, you should expect overwhelmingly public opinion and the voices we hear to be the ones that support the interests of concentrated interests.
Right. Okay. So what might be good is to run through a few issue areas and just I'm thinking of three countries that certainly are depicted as kind of inherent adversaries, you might say: Iran, Russia, and China. And certainly, it's not like none of them, any of them have done nothing to encourage that characterization. Um, I'd like to just go through them one at a time and get your take on, like, okay, so how are we viewing them, reacting to them? Why, from your perspective, do we have this view of them and this reaction to them?
Sure.
Okay. Now, the most topical is probably Russia and Ukraine. So, in your model, have at it. Why are we behaving the way why are we thinking of Russia? I mean, right now, of course, there's a lot of concern, and I have concern. I mean, I'm like pretty strict about international law, and I don't think it's a good thing when countries invade other countries.
Yeah.
So that's my take. But anyway, why do you think there is we're processing this the way we're processing it?
Yeah, so I mean, the modern relationship with Russia goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there's some debate about this, but I think most scholars who've looked seriously at it basically come to the conclusion. And my professor is my old professor Mark Trachtenberg at UCLA is one of the people who's done research on this. That basically there was a understanding that the U.S. would not expand NATO, that it would not go east, right? So basically, Germany is allowed to unify. I mean, what the Soviet Union does, I mean, is so historically unprecedented, right? An empire, just abolishes itself overnight. Gives basically lets these countries become independent. And so that this is sort of I think this is the outlook that Russians have. We basically surrendered and said your system is better, and we pulled back. And what else would you want from a country to show that it's no longer a threat? And the entire the entire justification for NATO. I mean, the only reason it existed was because there potentially could be a Soviet attack on Western Europe. I think my late advisor, Bob Jervis,
Mhm.
doesn't think that Soviet Union ever planned such a thing, but whatever, it was plausible. It could, people could have believed that. And this was the justification. And so NATO basically, a few members got added over the decades. Spain was added, I think in 1980 around there. But basically, for a long time, it was just basically set. It was just something to protect, Germany, West Germany, and everything west of that. And then so the Soviet Union collapses, then the U.S. starts, expanding it, and there's no more Soviet Union, and so you wonder what's going on. Well, not many Americans are really paying attention. This is not the most salient issue in the world in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, but you do have sort of a bipartisan support for continuing expansion. So these former communist countries come in, Hungary and Czech Republic, and then the U.S. and a lot of it there's lobbying on behalf of these governments themselves. There's like ethnic Polish representatives who really like the idea of Poland being defended by the U.S.
Now, those don't quite obviously, well, so you would categorize an ethnic constituency like that under influence of foreign governments because they identify with the foreign government in your model.
No, I wouldn't say that. I'm just, it's just
You're
sort of,
just okay. So
yeah.
this is a constituency that doesn't neatly fit into your three main actor model.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of sort of miscellaneous things
Right.
going on. Sure,
Okay.
and so yeah, so NATO expands, and no one is even debating why. I mean, these countries like then eventually it sort of gets to a point of absurdity where you're in the last few years. Bringing in Montenegro, bringing in these countries that have militaries that are smaller than the police force of a lot of American cities, and so Russia, I mean, is looking at this, and this clearly looks aggressive. I mean, you could see how this would look aggressive in the U.S. if Russia was making military alliances with every country surrounding the U.S. These other countries, they maybe have a rational they have a rational interest in this. It's insurance. I don't think they think Russia's going to invade tomorrow, but eventually it'd be good. It's good to have protection from the strongest country in the world.
Right.
And and there's also sort of I think this idea that that the idea that the Russian regime is the sort of, I think the idea of democracy promotion in the U.S. in the entire time is solidifying as a justification for American foreign policy continuing as it was. I think in the 1980s, you had people like Gene Kirkpatrick coming along and saying, we can make peace with certain dictators to fight, communism. And I think when communism goes away and starting the 1990s, every dictatorship becomes sort of morally suspect, right? It sort of doesn't have legitimacy. And so Russia.
Well, I mean, we still do business with a number of them uncomplainingly, but I take your point that
Yeah.
the rationale, however inconsistently applied,
Yeah.
has shifted.
There's always this is why, like I said, the whole point is it's not very coherent, right?
Yeah.
And so it's an issue when they want it to be an issue, and it's not the Saudi Arabia
Right.
question about American foreign policy is almost sort of like the refutation of everything America says it's doing. You just say, what about Saudi Arabia, right? And so, but because there's a sort of an interest in keeping this going with this conflict with Russia. The fact that Russia is anti-democratic or non-democratic, is a big deal and salient, and something that's on the front of our minds, every time we have to think about it. And I think that Russia does see sort of the idea that Ukraine is important culturally and historically, and there's an idea that they're trying to make them another permanent American ally. And I think that we are we're really playing with fire here, because we've kept going east, keep going step by step, and there's really no further you can go. And there's a lot of people in the U.S. who would like to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, they'd like to make that permanent. They'd like to give a defense guarantee. And it's so strange because there's no even like there's no even attempt to explain how this is in the American national interest. You always have to go to, it's either our values, and Ukraine, by the way, is a very corrupt country that shuts down TV stations, and it's always like,
right,
when they want to, even for like these democracy score things, which put out by Freedom House, which I think are stupid, but even they don't think Ukraine is very much more democratic or uncorrupt than Russia. And so we're exaggerating sort of what Russia wants.
yeah.
This is the first, it menaces, that we say these things like Putin menaces Europe. There's the Nord Stream pipeline thing is very, very interesting. You look at these senators who are like prioritizing this over almost any other issue. And Senator Rand Paul said recently, this is a kind of sort of protectionism. It's Ted Cruz is just in the forefront of this, partly ideology, but I think partly there's a interest in the energy industry in Texas. And this is sort of where we are with Russia.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say this is an example of what I meant when I said sometimes the problem is we don't attribute enough rationality to adversaries. It's like, and you're right. Maybe that's not exactly the way to put it, but I guess you might say we fail to entertain the hypothesis that a lot of what they do is, from their point of view, rationally defensive. So, for example, Russia in Syria, they have this naval station in Syria that is important to them. You didn't hear that brought up when Russia was intervening in Syria, by the way, at the invitation of the Syrian government. So unlike our troops in Syria, theirs were not in violation of international law.
Exactly. This is the very, very selective use of international law. Exactly.
Right. So, but anyway, they plausibly had an interest. They saw it as a kind of client state. We have our client states and our naval bases. Similarly, and I do not mean to defend the invasion and annexation of Crimea, but if you want to understand why it happened, there was a big naval base there of Russia's that they could have, in theory, lost if Ukraine fell into hostile hands. And we had, in a certain sense, intervened in Ukrainian politics to help a non-democratic transition of power that could have been viewed plausibly as a coup by Russia. That led to a president who was less, a government that was less, a Ukrainian government less favorable to Russia than what there had been. And so you don't, the American media coverage does not highlight these things. And I mean, even the elite, especially the elite, maybe New York Times, Wall Street Journal reporting, I mean, to varying degrees, you may see it sometimes, but is this itself a product of what you're talking about, right? I mean, and I'm not even talking about the op-eds. We can get to those, and I want to get to those. God knows there's pretty obvious influence via think tank funding and so on who gets to write the op-eds. But even, do you agree with even the just repertorial, quote, straight news coverage of these events does a terrible job of illuminating the actual motivations at work?
Yeah, unquestionably. I mean, I do talk a bit about the media, the national security sort of reporting community, whatever you want to call them, journalistic community, and it's a very unique thing because it's based on access. So you take a typical just New York Times or Washington Post foreign policy article on the front page, and there's often classified information there. When it's Assange who's releasing classified information, we put him in jail. But this is normal practice in foreign policy reporting. And who gets classified information? I mean, the government is picking, the national security establishment is picking the journalists who are going to report on it because they're the ones who are going to get all the scoops. And so you can look at sort of one of the examples I bring up, and this is there was a sort of symbiotic relationship between the national security press, people like Bob Woodward, and the generals who were trying to box Obama into surging in Afghanistan about a decade ago. And so, these are the people who get ahead in national security reporting. They often have, it's about. There was an article in it was Robin Wright. I think it was a New Yorker, or was it
Yes,
New
it was
York? I always get
the one about
those two
Iran
confused.
recently, or what? She generally writes for
Yeah,
the New
exactly.
Yorker. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the New Yorker. Then
I
yeah,
didn't read the piece, but
she's
yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, she goes to the Middle East, and she's hanging out with the generals in Syria and in Iraq, and
Right.
she's basically reflecting their view about the dangers of Iran, and no anti-war journalist is getting that kind of
Yeah.
access. And so you can look and you can say, well, she's a good journalist. I'm sure she's a fine journalist. But there's a sort of there's sort of an advantage here. She's going to be able to do her job better than somebody who the generals are going to look at with a sort of suspicious eye.
Right.
And so, yeah, even the straight news reporting. I mean, you can do this, anytime. You can I do this on Twitter. Other people, do it elsewhere. Just the way that the straight news reporting is framed in the Times and Wall Street Journal. It'll present the facts that are sort of international law. It will say things like, oh, Putin's another violation of international law when he invaded this country, not pointing out the U.S. invades more countries than everyone else put together over the last few decades.
Right.
Relevant information, I think, from a neutral perspective, but you won't find facts like that. You'll find the facts that sort of make the case from the perspective of the national security establishment.
Yeah, and just to stick with this theme for one more moment of how our view of the Russia situation may be ultimately shaped by the interests you're describing. You mentioned that I gather your I don't know if he was your PhD advisor at UCLA or what, Trachtenberg, had done work on this question of whether the U.S. implicitly or explicitly reassured Russia in the long ago that we would not expand NATO after the Cold War. This is something that James Baker was supposedly involved in. Maybe and maybe there were other conversations as well. James Baker was, of course, Secretary of State. Lately, I have seen a few revisitings of that question that have been on the side of the claim that no, there was no such reassurance. I've seen a lot of that in the media lately. Enough of it that I thought maybe my prior belief that there had been some kind of reassurance was just flat out wrong. But I guess in your view, it's like no coincidence that as things heat up in Ukraine and the policy, rubber is really meeting the road here, that somehow this perspective is kind of prevailing in the media. Maybe I'm imagining it, and I don't know if you've noticed it, but that's what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, there's two good papers. I mean, people can look at for this. One by a guy named John Schifferensen. He's a professor at Boston University, and then another by Trachtenberg. Yeah, I think the case is pretty solid. I mean, especially if you look at what people were saying at the time. Trachtenberg, he does a great thing. I think the article was published in a journal called International Security, where he goes basically day by day, and what's going on in the German media. What are they talking about? It's sort of what are the memoirs saying, and he really does sort of a nice little detective story, puts it together. Yeah, I think the argument is pretty solid. I mean, what people will say in responses, they'll say things like, Russia didn't get it, in writing, which is true, or they'll say, they'll often go to like later decisions where they sort of implicitly sort of accepted it. It's funny because Russia is also like a country that you could say maybe we expect a little too much coherence. There are little like fragments of this and that to look at what people. But I think at the top level, it's sort of the common understanding of the time. I think there was an understanding NATO wouldn't go east, and you could think like you could suspect why. Why would one explanation of why Russia didn't like get it in like a treaty or anything is like it wasn't guaranteed that this would happen. It was no guarantee that the U.S. would want to continue NATO and keep going east, right? Because you would think that maybe when the entire justification for NATO, which is the Soviet Union, goes away, I mean NATO maybe relaxes or maybe doesn't disband itself, but sort of just looks for less to do. But yeah, I mean you have to sort of each one of these things are so. Each one of these questions is so sort of fact dependent. So most people cannot, even very educated people who follow this stuff very closely, cannot research each one of these questions in any great depth. And you're always that you're having there's always this there's always sort of these interests and these people with this ideological view who have the megaphone and are always sort of presenting the version of facts that looks best for whatever they usually want to do. Even the government itself. I mean, there's just amazing information about the PR wing of the Pentagon, which I believe I don't know if this is exactly right, but I think that their budget one year at least was bigger than the entire budget of the State Department. So the Pentagon has its own full-time PR wing, and and even like think tanks like something like Rand Corporation gets all or almost all its money from the federal government. NGOs, by the way, if you look at their budgets, they're called non-governmental organizations, like literally called non-governmental organizations. You look at their budget, they're like 90% government. I mean, it's really amazing how we abuse these words. Freedom House is something I've written about on my Substack, and you look at like their leaderships. It's like ex-CIA director, secretary for state. So it's basically gets its money from the U.S. government.
Brookings is now run by an actual former general.
Exactly. Yeah, Brookings. Kind of
like, just to remove all doubt.
Yeah. So Brookings is Purple General. Yeah, even though, but the Brookings, I think probably the majority of their money probably comes from like things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it's not like Rand.
Well, yeah, but a lot of that's for domestic stuff. I mean, they have. Well, anyway,
they have broad interests. Exactly. Yeah,
they are not mainly a foreign policy shop, but I think if you look back at the beginning of the Iraq War, they played a non-trivial role in getting us into it.
Yeah, you're right there. Yeah. But anyways, these ones, Freedom House. I mean, they're staffed by the U.S. government, basically, and they're funded by the U.S. government, and they're called NGOs. I mean, there's something just sort of wrong with the way we're looking at this.
So let's move to another topic: Iran. Very much in the news. There's the Iran nuclear deal, and there I wouldn't say the forces of the establishment are at the moment arrayed against reviving a deal. That's kind of a complicated situation. On the other hand, I do think Iran is consistently depicted as more offensive than I think their strategy would really be objectively appraised as being. I think they see Syria largely as a buffer state, or at least partly as a buffer state, and so on. And in any event, again, by the way, they're in Syria with the permission of the government. Now, you may not like the government. I don't like the Syrian government, but the way the rules are in international relations is if the government that is in existence invites your troops into their country, you are not violating international law. Whereas when the U.S. puts troops in Syria and Israel launches strikes on Syria, they are violating international law. Those are the supposed rules. That's the
Yeah.
end of my sermon. Now, why don't you go ahead and say what you would from your perspective about Iran?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because the foreign policy sort of press establishment understands that when it comes to U.S. being in a foreign country, they'll say, "Oh, Ukraine has the right to join NATO, if it wants to invite, the U.S. in or Poland or anyone else." And then with Syria, it becomes completely irrelevant that the government wants Russia and Iran there. And then if you bring that up, they'll say, the Syrian government is a war crime. They commit war crimes and they don't have any legitimacy. So, they're just, you're not going to find consistent application of these rules. Yeah, I think that you're right. The establishment, I think that Obama, shifted things. Now he had to really fight for the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, he would not have gotten a majority in Congress to support. They didn't do a treaty because you need a 2/3 support in Senate. He wouldn't have even got a majority, right? The fact that he could do it as a just sort of executive action, and then you need 2/3 to overturn that, right? Because you need to pass a law, and then the president, said you need 2/3. So just because just the way it was set up, like he could get like 1/3 of Congress or 1/3 of the 1/3 of Congress to go along with him. I mean, that's all that was necessary. So you had this, and I think like partisanship is huge. I mean, I think it just becomes sort of associated with a Democratic president, and this had an effect to make Democrats and liberals more inclined towards favoring the Iranian nuclear deal, and Republicans more sort of stringent in opposing it. And so Trump comes in and he faces actual resistance from his generals. One of the few times the generals, I argue they're not always unequivocally pro-war. The establishment, I think they're pro-status quo and inertia, and that's the bias. So
well, they like to have a lot of weapons, so in that way they're aligned with the arms manufacturers. But being the ones who actually have to fight the wars, they do sometimes caution the politicians about the difficulty of war. That's a real thing, I think.
Yeah, that's occasionally a real thing. Sometimes they're less hawkish than the civilian. I think most of the time they're more hawkish than civilians. But in the case of, for example, the run up to Iraq, I think the Pentagon was not necessarily more hawkish, at least at the lower level. At the top, they were just nodding along with whatever Bush wanted. And so you have this funny thing where there's everything in American politics is sort of geared towards confrontation with Iran. One of the funny thing is I talk about foreign governments. The foreign government that can influence U.S. foreign policy is Iran because of the sanctions, right? So the sanctions regime has this very funny influence where if you're Saudi Arabia,
can or can't influence?
Cannot. Okay. Because it can't spend money in it has no embassy in the U.S. even. I mean, so your UAE, your Israel, your Saudi Arabia, influence American foreign policy to your heart's content. If you're Iran, you can't, and you can see how this can, obviously bias things. In the run up, the decade before the Iraq War, it was, Saddam, was looking for a way to talk to the U.S. It just couldn't. I mean, couldn't even communicate clearly, what he wanted, or work out any kind of, sort of a move away from the sanctions and towards more normalized relations. And so, you have to understand, and sort of you have to understand sort of the landscape, is sort of shaped by this. But to get back to sort of more recent events. So Trump, rips up the Iranian nuclear deal, and I think Biden comes in, and for reasons because of establishment and partisanship and just because it makes sense, they want to get back into the Iranian nuclear deal. And I think at this point the problem is, and Republicans will say this, that it's going to be torn up the second a Republican gets elected. And I think that's unquestionably true. I mean, it's every Republican says this. I mean, so basically you cannot negotiate in a way that's lasting. Anything that you can guarantee will last beyond 2024. And this makes international negotiations, very, very hard. And that's where we're stuck. And I think that's become the barrier to sort of getting back to the Iranian nuclear deal, which made sense for all involved, but is disliked by certain interests in this country.
So, what are the key interests? I mean, obviously, Bibi Netanyahu made no secret of the fact that he opposed the deal during the, I think, Obama administration, and as you point out, that's what. The overall political resistance Obama faced led the deal to have a less substantial foundation. It didn't have didn't have the status of a treaty. It was easier for Trump to roll back, to withdraw from. and that had the support of Bibi. So obviously Israel was one actor. What I mean, how would you assess the overall kind of array of influence on that issue?
Yeah, so I mean, so I think that the theory behind the Iranian nuclear deal was, look, what we care about is non-proliferation. Iran has other disputes with its neighbors and other activities in the region, but let's shelve sort of the nuclear issue and give them something they want, which is sanctions relief and economic integration, and take care of the nuclear issue. And I think the Republicans and Netanyahu and the Gulf Arab states take a broader sort of view on on Iranian influence, right? And they're not happy, and so they're unhappy with the deal. That just basically if you take nuclear proliferation off the table, but Iran is better integrated in the region and has a stronger economy, that's probably a net loss for them. And they will say things like it doesn't actually prevent them from getting a nuclear bomb. Only people who are the only people who believe that are basically Republicans and Gulf states and the Israelis. Everyone else in the world, from from the Europeans to the Chinese to the Russians, do think that it prevents them from getting a nuclear weapon. So that I think is not credible, but they'll use that argument to argue against the deal. And the question is, what are do Saudi Arabia and Israel have rational reasons to fear Iranian influence? Yeah, maybe. I mean, the Iranians are supporters of Palestinians. They're supporters of Shia across the region, and Saudi Arabia sees that as a threat, particularly in Yemen. So it's not crazy that they see things this way. I mean, the question I think for the U.S. is why we should care whether the Shia or the Sunni, what the balanced power of that is in any particular country. Often the Shia are the oppressed ones, like they have been in Bahrain, and they are under Saudi, and usually the U.S. wants to be on the side of an oppressed minority against a majority, but we don't see it that way. And so the question is, what are American interests here? And it's just very hard to understand outside the context of there's very influential actors who want American interests to be just checking Iran more generally.
And the arms manufacturers, I think, if you look at the most kind of anti-Iranian think tank, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I'm pretty sure they get arms money right. So I guess you would say the arms makers are. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's like, it probably isn't so much they favor actual war. They just favor depicting everyone as hostile enough so that we have to keep buying weapons, right? Yeah. I mean, and so they do seem to be funding some of the depiction of Iran as a mortal threat to the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of a you fund certain people who like, I think my model is basically they want bigger military budgets, and so that's their direct interest, right? And so they fund people who want bigger military budgets. People who want bigger military budgets have other opinions that they bring along with it, right? So those people tend to be the ones that they rise to prominence and influence, and they have opinions about everyone potentially being a threat. So I don't think the weapons manufacturers necessarily want war all the time. Sometimes maybe they do, or sometimes they don't. I think that's less direct to their interest. I think that's a byproduct of them supporting people, getting people in those positions of power is a byproduct of them supporting bigger military budgets and finding people who would support
and
that.
they certainly want to sell weapons to Ukraine and Taiwan and anyone else who will buy them.
Of course, yeah. Oh, yeah. There it's more direct. Yeah, when there's a interest in selling weapons, yeah, absolutely. You're right. You're right on.
So that Taiwan brings us to China. How do you size that whole situation up now?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a real, geopolitical issue where China is, but if you measure, depending on how you measure, the largest economy in the world, or will soon get there, and it's natural. It's gonna, it's sort of relations with the world will change, like any rising power in human history. I think there was a lot of, so I have a chapter on China. And there's sort of this myth that in the 1990s, there was this idea that people thought that it would democratize, it would become like us if we just traded with them. I don't think that's what's going on, because that doesn't really make any sense. I mean, even if it did democratize, like it would, that goes against American hegemony, right? There are 1.4 billion people now, and they were going to be the strongest country in the world. So like first of all, it was a strange thing to bank on like the internal political developments in the country. The second thing is, even if those developments did go in the direction predicted, they would still be a rival. I mean, just because they're such a big and strong, they're such a big country. And so I think, but my understanding of, what we did with China is basically the concentrated interest here was business, and business wanted to open up China. And I think it was a good, it was a good thing. It was good for China. It was good for the US. It was good for humanity, mostly, despite some problems. And then at the same time, because we don't have a grand strategy, the military was also, doing things to sort of to make sure that the U.S. stayed in the region and tried to be the dominant power and have influence over the U.S. allies. So it was sort of inevitable that economic integration would lead to China becoming this probably would have happened anyway, becoming the dominant power in East Asia. But we weren't ready to accept the sort of geopolitical and military consequences of that. And so, look, I mean, China has border disputes with its neighbors. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have border disputes with Latin America because it settles them. I mean, if the U.S. had a border dispute with Mexico, that would be it wouldn't last. It wouldn't last for very long, right? And so China has these border disputes. Some of them are a little bit more. Are a little bit more unreasonable, like the 15 line in the South China Sea. Some of them are just things that have been there forever, like the conflict with India, and then Taiwan. But the Taiwan issue is the big one, and I think this is the sort of the place where it's hard to reconcile what America wants and what China wants. Mm-hmm. They see it as part of China, and we negotiated with them and never. There's a biography of Deng Xiaoping by Ezra Vogel. It basically talks about when Deng was, they were opening up China. There was basically an understanding of American leaders at the time, at least in the Carter administration, that eventually Taiwan would become part of China. I mean, it was just something we were going to live with because we weren't going to fight them over it. It was China cared a lot more about it than we did.
Well, we supported the actual transfer of the United Nations seat from Taiwan to China. That kind of suggested that we agreed with them on the.
Yeah, every signal was we could live with whatever happened, happened between China and Taiwan, and now it's become it's very strange. It's like they hid. Maybe coronavirus leaked from the lab. Like, okay, so and then there's there's the situation with the Uyghurs, there's a situation with Hong Kong, and then it becomes military confrontation, and the sort of the logical connection between whether the coronavirus leaked from a lab in Wuhan and what the U.S. should do about Taiwan is not very, or whether we should boycott the Olympics or whatever. It's not really there. That they're not making. I think it's more along the lines of it. You think about it as sort of, you're trying to just create this idea that China is bad, right? So you're throwing everything against the wall. And then when it comes to talking about something concrete like Taiwan, or potentially fighting over some stupid islands, that Japan also claims, the people's ideas are just China's so bad, China is so aggressive and so evil and so malevolent, that people will go along with what the foreign policy hawks want to do. But in reality, Taiwan, I mean, the Taiwan, doesn't matter. I mean, the semiconductor thing, look, I mean, if China took it over, they would just sell you the semiconductors. If you're really worried about that, if there's some kind of adjustment cost, I don't think you could do the math where a war is less costly than, whatever it would cost to replicate the semiconductor industry, or buy it from somewhere else. The market, will adjust. And so you have these, and so you have this. I think what's going on, I guess, at the broader level is that there's always a need for some kind of foreign adventurism, because the military budget is there, and all these people's jobs depend on it. So in the 1990s, that's when the Soviet Union collapsed. That's when we started hearing about rogue states and the responsibility to protect. Mm-hmm. Then we had 9/11, and that
the responsibility to protect being the idea that if governments fail, well, it basically winds up being a justification for military intervention on grounds of human rights violations within a country, which had not been a big part of international law prior to that. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's a coincidence we started hearing about that in the 1990s, when there sort of needed to be a new justification for American foreign policy. But then 9/11 happens, And I think, the war on terror is sort of winding down. It really doesn't scare people. It doesn't give us much to do. And I think that the focus on China is sort of a result of that, and that it's the next, it's the next thing that we have to worry about. And so, the U.S. I mean, it really. I mean, we're lucky that there's a rising power, and it's not. There's no indications that it's crazy, that it wants to, militarily conquer the world. There's no long-standing border dispute or anything natural sort of conflict of interest that the U.S. has with it. I think we should, live with the fact that it's going to be a stronger country and it's going to have more geopolitical influence. It's going to settle disputes with Vietnam and the Philippines on its own terms, because it's much, much bigger, just like the U.S. settles disputes with Latin America on its own terms. And, we should, hope that it's, humane, and there's no wars or intervention or anything like that. But, the idea that China is just going to be another country in East Asia is just naive. And I think we have to realize that.
And how would you allocate responsibility among your big three actors, the national security establishment, the arms makers, and foreign governments, for this common view of China that you see as not entirely justified? That is to say, the view of it as some kind of implacable adversary or expansionist power.
Yeah, I think they're all there, but I think that probably the national security establishment is big here, because I talk to people in DC, and they say, if you want to sell any idea to sort of, getting funding from the Pentagon or some research establishment, you have to frame it as, the US is gearing towards conflict with China. And, you look at the White House documents, national strategy documents produced during the Trump administration. This was a really, really big idea. I think that if China is not there, if the so-called China threat is not there, you have really a crisis in the foreign policy establishment, because there's no existential risk. There's nothing really much to do now that terrorism is sort of seen as, something in the rear view mirror, right? You need sort of China to justify the whole thing. So I think that's what's mostly driving it. Of course, you have foreign governments too, but I don't think they're playing a huge role.
Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, they lobby, they have money, they can buy arms, and so on. It's not trivial.
Yeah.
You just kind of alluded to something. I mean, sometimes I think the issue is partly, again, money shapes what kinds of people get hired by think tanks and so on. But I also think there's come to be something about kind of the self-conception of people who are drawn into the establishment, whether it's like think tanks or or government service. There's a kind of a self-dramatization that, look, we are all prey to. We all think we're more important than we are. I get it. But there's this, you know what I mean? Kind of like, does this not make any sense to you?
No, it makes sense. I think you can see that, the focus on money and concentrated interest should not distract us from these people believe it. And I think Twitter is such a great tool, not just on this issue, but everything else, because you see people's you see their reaction to things in real time. And, people are not, on Twitter 24 hours a day, because they're being paid. Often, they may end up making fools of themselves. But you could really see the emotional reaction to, like, for example, when Trump wanted to pull out of Syria, or you could see the emotional reaction to Biden ending the war in Afghanistan. People are very good at convincing themselves what they want to believe. Some people maybe would come to these conclusions, naturally, and they get positions of power and influence. And you could see the appeal of that. You could see the appeal of a historical narrative where, there's international anarchy, bad things happen. You have World War I, you have World War II. The U.S. comes in, it beats Nazi Germany, it stands up to communism. It eventually helps end this Soviet Union. And like, if there's nothing like that now, you just, that can be sort of emotionally and like sort of spiritually deflating. I think that I think electoral politics matter a lot too. I think Republicans are sort of have this muscle memory of, the Cold War and the war on terror were generally good for them. That when international issues rose in salience. One thing political scientists say is when basically classically when domestic issues were higher in salience, Democrats did better, and when international issues were higher in salience or social issues, Republicans tended to do better. That might not hold as much anymore, but there's sort of this muscle memory. Okay, war on terror, Cold War, and it's a hint that they're always talking about the Chinese Communist Party, which that's what it is. But like I've heard that term more in the last like 2 years than I heard the entire history of reading or talking about China. So it seems like this nostalgia for the Cold War when
Right.
China
The use
is
of
less
the word.
communist. Yeah, when China's less communist than ever. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
It's true that it's called the Communist Party, but this is not a communist country. I mean,
yeah.
There are, it's also not a liberal democracy, and there are unflattering terms you can accurately apply to it, but communist is not one of them. So yeah, and on the human rights issue, I mean, I always find this challenging because it's good to be aware of human rights issues in that sense. It's good that there's a human rights lobby and these groups that shed light on human rights problems. But in my view, usually most of our attempts to do something about human rights make things worse for the humans themselves. There are two forms of intervention. One is economic sanctions, the other is military. Those are the two main things. It just seems like usually we make things worse. The sanctions hurt the people we claim to be protecting and so on. And I'm kind of heartened by knowing at least a few people who work at these human rights groups who seem at least a little aware of this tension. But what's your take on the human rights lobby?
Yeah, so I have a chapter on sanctions in the book, and it's the sanctions regime. I mean, it's really brutal. I mean, the U.S. will cut a country off from the entire international economic system, and like you can't use a credit card there. Nobody can have banking, and then you have like a humanitarian. Okay, we'll let some UN food in there. Like no, like imagine if someone destroyed the entire American economy, put us in a Great Depression, and then let us have a little bit of aid and said this is a humanitarian policy. It's the cutting off of the economic avenues of sort of growth and people being able to live their lives that's important more than the aid, which is the foreign policy establishment focuses on. So yeah, but the standard response, you don't like something that happened in a foreign country, what the government is doing, so you put sanctions on. Sometimes they're targeted, but sometimes they're much broader, and you'll basically say we want to hurt the government, and you hurt the government by destroying the entire economy of the people. And you can look at some studies that we've done. One study suggested 40,000 excess deaths in 1 year in Venezuela. Venezuela was already having economic problems, and then the Trump administration made it much worse by going all in on a regime change. And so it's questionable. Often human rights is just posturing. I mean, it doesn't do anything, and then often when it does lead to action, it's negative and hurts more people. One example in China right now. There's a bad situation. There's obviously abuses against the Uyghur population, and what the U.S. has been doing is to decide to ban all trade with anybody with anything made in Xinjiang. And so, like, basically, you're saying no Uyghur can get a job because some Uyghurs suffered under the Chinese regime. And so they'll call it like slave labor, or they'll say it has to be proven, which it's impossible to prove that at every step of the supply chain. And so you have to think carefully.
You mean they say if you're going to buy it, you have to prove that there was no coercive slave labor, whatever.
My understanding, it's basically an impossible standard. So it's just basically a ban on anything.
So companies just avoid the whole region.
Exactly, which is not good for Uyghurs. I mean, and this is sort of directly analogous to what's happening. The Cuba policy has been for 60 years, more than 60 years at this point. About 60 years. And so yeah, I mean, there's a real problem here. I mean, and there's a couple of things you could say about human rights. I wrote a paper on the U.S. involvement in Syria. Often, wanting to do something about human rights make it worse because the countries basically commit atrocities when they're feeling threatened. So if the U.S. is going for regime change against the government has more of an interest in clamping down on dissent. And I think this happened. In Syria. We made the government poorer. We made it more desperate. We put its back against the wall. We basically told the Syrian government, you're going to end up like Gaddafi. We're going to support people until until they come and they kill you. And they're really, their backs really were up against the wall. I mean, I think that's clear from the historical record in Syria. And so it's often like this. I mean, if the U.S. bangs its fist on the table about Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, does that make Hong Kong or the Uyghurs better off? The people, it's hard to show that. It usually makes them worse off, because all we have in the toolbox is basically sanctions and war, and both of those options are often very bad for the people on the ground. So I think it's admirable to care about human rights. I mean, another thing that's important for human rights and people being mobilized is having a stable government, right? So we go and we get rid of a human rights violator, and then you have 20 years of civil war. Did we improve human rights in Iraq? No, we had some bad things happening, and we came and we made it worse. So I think we need to be thinking carefully about the connections between whatever actions we decide to take and the outcome. And there's just no indication that we've been doing that.
Well, the craziest thing to me in political terms right now is the Afghanistan thing, where Biden, by continuing to withhold significant resources, it seems to me, ensuring that the withdrawal is going to be viewed as a disaster, because there's going to be a humanitarian disaster. I don't understand why he wants to do that.
That's a political case for, so Afghanistan, right? It's really just heartbreaking, because when they were trying to argue against withdrawal, the idea was we can't abandon the Afghan people, and basically the Taliban comes in and they win. Basically, they take the country without a civil war. So that concern that it would be a bloodbath was largely it didn't happen. But now the real threat to the Afghan people is basically mass starvation, because it was dependent on foreign aid, and U.S. sanctions go beyond just withholding the money Afghanistan has. It makes it difficult for any aid agency or any business to do anything with Afghanistan. And for the most part, these voices that cared about Afghanistan, 6 months ago, they're just not there. And you wonder, what's going on with these people? Are they just, are they cynical, or are they just, can they only sort of get excited about a human rights violation if it involves them riding to the rescue as heroes, with guns and bombs, right? I think that's what's going on here. But just study Afghanistan to see sort of how seriously you should take these humanitarian concerns when they're used to justify American foreign policy.
Okay, my final question, and after this, I'll let you say whatever you want about the book before we go. But is it the case that China, Iran, Russia, because their political systems are less pluralistic? Now, I think we overestimate the extent to which so-called autocracies are autocracies. The fact is, and I think one mistake we make is not understanding that even so-called dictators do have to be responsive to domestic constituencies. They certainly care what the people think about them. That said, these systems are less obviously pluralistic. Does that mean that their foreign policies actually are more coherent than ours?
Yeah, I mean, it could be the case. Now, I think each one of these countries is a little bit different. I think Iran actually does have a lot of pluralism. I mean, the fact that they have a religious police, and they have some lines they don't allow to be crossed as far as civil society and rights for women, doesn't mean that there isn't something resembling.
And they have elections that have a kind of consequence, even if the candidates are screened and so on. But
exactly, yeah. I mean, there's real politics. There's real politics in Iran. Yeah. So one of the axes you can look at is sort of authoritarian versus democracy. But another thing is, often our disputes with these countries are things that they have a much more direct interest in. So like I said, when the US in the World War II has something more like a grand strategy. So when Russia is thinking about Ukraine, it's not like when the US is thinking about Ukraine. Ukraine in the US is just a word sort of, people get most passionate about, it as something to like impeach Trump over or defend Trump over, right? Ukraine is just such an abstraction to us, and maybe it's the 100th most important thing in our politics. And for Russia, it's near the top, right? And so it's going to get the government's time and attention and efforts. And the U.S. I think could have more of a grand strategy, if we actually face some kind of invasion from abroad. And so you have to think about sort of the when I say there's no American grand strategy, it's like these broad strategies about liberal internationalism or our primacy. As far as like what to do about country X, which is the extent of our disputes with other countries, like China is mostly about Taiwan, Iran is about Israel and the Gulf countries and its neighbors. So like whether you could have a strategy towards one or two battlefields or one or two potential battlefields versus whether you could have like a upholding a global order. So we're talking sort of different definitions of grand strategy when we're talking here. But sort of the broader, like sort of political sciencey kind of question is whether authoritarian regimes in general just might be better at planning. I think it's not just foreign policy. I mean, I think we could look at the coronavirus response in China versus the U.S. I think this is just such a broad and interesting question, and because it's so broad and interesting, I don't really I punt, like I said, I punt on it on the book and try to explain American foreign policy and leave it at that.
That's enough for any one person, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about the book before we go?
Not really. I mean, it's expensive hardcover because it's academic books often do this. The Kindle is more affordable. So if you don't actually need a Kindle device to own a Kindle. Somebody I saw said I don't have a Kindle. No, you can read a Kindle on your iPhone or your computer or whatever. So yeah, I mean, get the book and I highly recommend it.
Okay, it's called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy: How Generals, Weapons Manufacturers, and Foreign Governments Shape American Foreign Policy. And where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me just under my name, Richard Hanania. I'll pop up, and then richardhanania.substack, and you can stay updated. CSPI podcast, that's the podcast that I have for my organization, and CSPI org on Twitter, cspicenter.org. But yeah, just sign up to my Substack. I think you'll be able to find everything from there.
And I am at Robert Writer on Twitter. And as long as we're talking Substack, I put out the Nonzero newsletter. Well, congratulations on the book. It's your first book. So enjoy the experience, the fame, the celebrity, which I'm sure is already coming your way, as it always does with books in my experience. Right? Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Thanks,
well, let's too soon to tell.
We'll see how much celebrity we get out of the book on international relations theory.
It's an extremely worthwhile book, so everybody should get it.
Appreciate that
on the Kindle platform of their choice. All right, thanks, Richard.